everyone, it's Nina and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing a video that has been going around BookTube lately, and that is the worst books I've ever read according to Goodreads. I'm also going to probably do a best books I've ever read according to Goodreads, although the secret is that neither of these are actually going to be according to Goodreads. They're going to be according to Storygraph, because that is the social media of choice that I have done for my book tracking. I actually recently made it, so I'm going to link down below my Storygraph if you're interested in following me, or just like looking at my account. I don't actually know if you can follow people on there. But anyway, I prefer Storygraph over Goodreads because they are not owned by Amazon, so Bezos is not getting any of my personal data. Anyway, I'd say that the rankings for Goodreads versus Storygraph are pretty much the same in every count. I'll mention ones where it is drastically different, like over, maybe 0.25 or half of a point difference. I think overall Goodreads tends to rate a little bit lower just because they have a larger pool of users. And I feel like when there's going to be more people, there's going to be a greater variety of opinion. But for the most part, I think this is still reflective of both the Goodreads and the Storygraph community. Anyway, with that long intro out of the way, I have 10 books I want to talk about here that are the worst rated according to my Storygraph. So let's get right on into the video. So currently, the highest rated of the worst books that I've read has a 3.72, and that is Carmilla by Joseph Chardin Le Fanu. You will see a theme with the top 10 worst books, and that is that a lot of them, I think at least 3 or 4 of them on this list, are classics. And my thought process with this is probably twofold. One is that I think a lot of people associate classics with being in middle school and high school and having to read them. So they kind of associate them with more work and academic things and not necessarily reading for pleasure. So it's kind of a negative connotation going into any sort of classic book. The other thing is that I think a lot of people view classics as kind of essential reading, and you have to read them because reading them makes you a better person or a better reader, which I think is pretty stupid because I don't think classics have any intrinsic value that makes them a better holder of knowledge versus a more modern book. But I do think that at the same time people get sucked into that idea that they have to read a classic in order to be considered a real reader. But obviously if they're not necessarily used to reading classics, or it just isn't necessarily going to be their genre, they're going to not come out of it with as high a rating as someone that is more used to reading classics and likes reading classics. Anyway, that's just kind of my analysis of why I think classics are rated lower on social media platforms like Goodreads and the Storygraph. Anyway, talking about Carmilla specifically, it is a vampire novella that came out before Dracula. It's often touted as having a lot of sapphic undertones. I think they're very much undertones. It definitely wasn't at the level that I had hoped it would be going into it. But I think this rating is pretty solid. I think I ended up giving it a 4 stars, but going back on it, I feel like I would put it closer to a 3.5. The next book we are going to be talking about is Bunny by Mona Awad. This is definitely a controversial one. I think this is a book that a lot of people love or hate. It has a 3.7 on the Storygraph and a 3.5 on Goodreads. I personally really enjoyed Bunny when I first read it. I think I initially even gave it a 5 stars, but going back on it, I feel like it just wasn't as perfect as I had made it out to be. I think when I was first getting into my reading journey, I would rate things 5 stars if I enjoyed them relatively at all. But now I kind of really try to hold 5 stars as being the creme de la creme, all-time favorite books. So I think I would rather put Bunny at a 4 or a 4.5. I really enjoyed how it was written. I feel like it definitely is a book that warrants a lot of rereads to get a lot of the details in it. But just going off of writing style, it definitely piqued my interest and I enjoyed it enough that I definitely would like to look at other books that Mona Awad has put out. The next book on this list, which has a 3.64 on the Storygraph, is The Monk by Matthew Lewis. This book, I think I gave it 5 stars or 4.5 stars too. This is another classic gothic tale that has just every trigger imaginable. It's incredibly crazy. I actually really enjoyed it, and I did not find the writing style to be too difficult to get into. And I feel like since there is kind of that bridge with classics, it can be hard to really become immersed in the story because of the writing difference. But with this story, I was able to get into following the characters and really feeling for them, and there were a lot of parts that were very shocking and horrifying for me. And this is the type of book that wants to shock and horrify you, so I definitely think it met its goal there. I really like it. I think if you like gothic stories or you want to read a more obscure, weird classic, it's definitely one to check out. The next book on this list with a 3.53 is She's Too Pretty to Burn by Wendy Hurd. I completely understand why this book is rated what it is. I wouldn't say it's necessarily a great book. I wouldn't say necessarily it's a bad book. It's very mediocre to me. I think I rated it 4 stars, but that was more that I just enjoyed the ride and didn't try to think about it too seriously. It's supposed to be a Dorian Gray retelling, but it focuses much more on the beauty and kind of art aspect of Dorian Gray versus the I'm able to live forever by putting all of my negative traits inside of a painting. It's actually not supernatural at all. It's just a YA contemporary thriller. I think I originally described the writing style as being sparse, and I definitely think that that is probably the biggest drawback of the book. It's very straightforward. There's not a lot of nuance in it. And it's just kind of like a book you have to kind of like go along for the ride for and enjoy it for what it is. It's a perfectly acceptable contemporary thriller, but it's not really anything surprising. The next book on this list is the only one I think people got wrong. This book has a 3.42, and that is Lake's Edge by Linda Clipstone. This book I rated 4.5 stars, and I really, really enjoyed it. In my initial review, I did say that I did not enjoy the first third of this book very much, but I did enjoy the second 2/3 of this book enough now where I am really, really excited for the second part of the duology to come out. I don't really know how to describe this easily. I guess it's a YA gothic fantasy romance. I think the thing I liked the most about this was the love triangle, which is really surprising because usually I hate love triangles, especially in like YA. I feel like they can be really over-contrived, but I felt like both of the love interests were really interesting and had their own motivations for being with the main character that were very different, but also very valid and super interesting. But yeah, I really enjoyed this book, definitely recommend it, and I think it deserves higher than a 3.4. Next book on this list with a 3.39 is Reign of the Fallen by Sarah Glenn Marsh. This book was one that was a huge disappointment to me. It was one of the first like sapphic stories I had read in a really, really long time. But I just really, really did not enjoy the main couple. This is kind of a spoiler, but the main relationship is between the main character and the main character's boyfriend's younger sister. But I really just dislike kind of like jumping from one sibling to the next sibling for a romance. This also kind of had like an unexpected trigger of drug abuse, which I was not expecting going into it. That was probably my own fault for not looking up the triggers ahead of time, but I kind of don't really like to look up triggers because most things I don't really find offensive in books. But this is one that I really didn't like, and it kind of like took me out of the story for a while. But at the same time, I don't necessarily think it's a bad book. I'm surprised it has such a low rating, because I think that the rest of the parts of the story, especially like the word building, were done pretty well. And I thought the writing style was pretty good. I definitely don't think I liked the characters enough to continue on with the duology, but I also think that a lot of that is like a personal opinion. So I'm surprised that this is not rated higher than a 3.39. The next book on this list with a 3.38 is The Death of Jane Lawrence by Caitlin Sterling. This book is one I talked about recently in a video, and I mentioned in that this seems to be a book that a lot of people either love or really hate. I think because of like Bunny, it has a very like ambiguous ending section to it. So a lot of people who like that kind of more open-ended, kind of confusing ending really, really enjoy this type of story, where a lot of people kind of feel like it's very unfulfilling. I'm a little bit more on the unfulfilling side, mostly because I feel like the development of the main character and her like romantic interest, they just didn't really have enough like development throughout the story to have the payoff. Overall, I found this book was okay. I definitely enjoyed the first half more than the second half for a lot of different reasons. The next book on this list has a 3.25 on Storygraph and a 3.12 on Goodreads, and that is Catherine House by Elizabeth Thomas. This book I really, really didn't like, and I am surprised when I initially put this book in like my year-end review. I think I rated it like a 3 or a 3.5. This book definitely deserves that. It's closer to a 2.5 upon reflection of what my experience was reading this. I tried to read this book during a time when I was having a little bit of a reading slump, and I feel like this just dragged me further and further into that reading slump. This book is a contemporary dark academia horror novel. I call it horror very lightly because very, very little happens in this book. It's much more about the atmosphere of this weird school called Catherine House that the main character is going to. But I just felt like it was very repetitive and not a lot was happening. I didn't really like the main character. I found she was kind of annoying. And the big reveal at the end just kind of was very like surface level, and it didn't really feel like we got to dive deeper into it. Yeah, I definitely did not like this book very much. I think this was a debut author, so hopefully if she's come up with anything else since then, it turns out to be a lot better. Okay, we're on to the final two books, the two worst books that I've read according to the Storygraph. And coming in at 3.15 is The Turn of the Screw by Henry James. This book was my worst rated book of 2021. I really, really didn't like it. It was hard to read through, and it's only like 100 pages long, but at the same time, it dragged so heavily. I think I rated this 2 stars. It's probably the worst rated book I've done so far. The only reason I didn't rate it even lower than that is that there were a couple moments where I was a little bit shocked and surprised and a little bit gripped by the story that was going on. But for the majority of it, I just felt like it fell really flat. I didn't understand like what the purpose of the story was. And I'm not really sure like why this warrants being like such a, I don't know, like beloved and constantly remade gothic tale. because there's been multiple movie and TV show adaptations of the story over the years. And I don't know if it's because it is such a basic story that a lot of like directors and artists can kind of like use it as bare bones to put their own individual twist on it, or maybe there's just like another deeper layer that I'm just not getting because I don't have like some type of like historical context, or like I wasn't able to focus on a lot of the details because I wasn't able to get into it through the writing style. But regardless, this is the second worst book that I apparently have ever read. And the last book, the worst rated book that I have read, according to the Storygraph, with a 2.91, is The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. This book kind of has a very wide difference in opinion between the Storygraph and Goodreads. Like I said, on the Storygraph it is a 2.91, but on Goodreads it's actually a 3.43, which I definitely think it falls closer in line to the 2.91 side. I think initially when I read this book, I rated it as a 3.5, but upon further reflection, I think it's closer to a 2.5. This is definitely one that is quite hit or miss for people. One thing that's kind of interesting about it is that it's told without any chapters. It's just like one gigantic stream of consciousness, which is kind of interesting to read. I will say, and this is kind of embarrassing, but I was listening to the audiobook and whoever the narrator was, he was absolutely like lulling me to sleep, because this book, even though it wasn't very boring, there's a lot of stuff that happens in it, I was just like falling asleep when I was listening to it. That being said, it's not a very calming or relaxing story. There's a lot of really horrible things that go on in it. This book is definitely like one of the less horrible ones of the Imperial Gothic genre, and I'm happy that I read it just to have like that experience. I never read this in school or anything, and I feel like it's one that is pretty commonly taught in high schools. But at the same time, I don't really necessarily recommend it to anyone. And with that, we have my full list of the 10 worst books I have ever read, according to the Storygraph. I'd love to know what is like the worst rated book you've ever read, or if you have a favorite book that for some reason has particularly low reviews on either Goodreads or the Storygraph. It's always interesting to find a book that you like that isn't liked by the general population, because it's like, what is it that I see in this book that apparently no one else was able to see? But anyway, that is it for today's video. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I really would appreciate it if you liked this video or considered subscribing if you aren't already. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye!